All right, welcome back for our final section on World War II. So World War II was also the high point for organized labor in the United States, which contributed to middle and working class gains during and after the war. The demands for wartime production, combined with the departure of millions of American workers to the military, created a labor shortage that gave unions increased leverage. And remember that during the New Deal, organized labor experienced a historically friendly political context. So as a recap, union membership had decreased after World War I and the 1920s to only 4 million in 1933. The New Deal policies, such as the Wagner Act and significant grassroots efforts by labor organizers, had allowed membership to increase to 9 million by the beginning of the war. By 1945, union membership had grown to nearly 14 million, representing about 1/3 of the nation's workforce. In 1942, the Roosevelt administration established the National War Labor Board, which regulated wages, hours, and working conditions, and authorized the government to take over plants that refused to abide by its decisions. The war marked a watershed moment in the status of women. So with millions of men going into military service, the demand for civilian workers challenged old prejudices about gender roles. Between 1940 and the peak of wartime employment in 1944, the number of employed women rose more than 50% to 6 million. Also, for the first time in U.S. history, married working women outnumbered single working women. At the start of the war, about half of women employees held poorly paid clerical, sales, or service jobs. Women in manufacturing labored mainly in low-wage textile and clothing factories. During the war, however, the overall number of women in manufacturing grew 141%. In industries producing directly for war purposes, the figure jumped by 463%. As women moved into defense-related jobs, their incomes also improved. As impressive as these figures are, however, they do not tell the whole story. First, although married women entered the job market in record numbers, most of these workers were older and without young children. The government did very little to encourage young mothers to work, and few efforts were made to provide assistance for childcare for those who did. This is significant because it signals to us that Americans still considered women's primary role to be in the home taking care of children. Second, openings for women in manufacturing jobs did not guarantee equality. So women received lower wages for work comparable to the work performed by men, and women did not have the same chances for advancement. So typical union benefits such as seniority hurt women who were generally the most recent hires. And third, gender stereotypes continue to dominate the workforce and society in general. Magazine covers with the image of Rosie the Riveter, a woman with her sleeves rolled up and her biceps bulging, became a symbol for the recruitment of women, but reality proved different. The government, private employers, and mass media advertised for women workers by adapting traditional views of women to their new roles. So one advertisement suggested that an overhead crane operated just like a gigantic clothes wringer, and that winding the wire spools was very much like crocheting. The most important caveat to women's progress during the war was the temporary nature of the gains in employment. Women who took war jobs were viewed not so much as war workers, but as women temporarily occupying men's jobs during the national emergency. In fact, some contracts stipulated that women's tenure in jobs previously held by men would last only for the duration of the war. As the war drew to a close, public relations campaigns shifted gears and encouraged the same women they had recently recruited to prepare to return back to the private sphere of their home. And here we have two photos. On the top photo, we have the Women's Air Force service pilots who were dubbed WASP during World War II. We don't have time to go into it today, but WASP is really just super badass all around. And then in the second photo, we have members of the Women's Army Corps, WAC, and they're posing at Camp Shanks in New York before leaving from New York port of embarkation in 1945. And these women are with the first contingent. They were the first contingent of Black American WACs to go overseas for the war effort. So before World War II, women had strict dress codes and social codes. For instance, it was unacceptable to wear pants, to go out alone, or to live alone. But World War II brought really drastic changes for this, as women were recruited for the war efforts and worked at factories while men were at the war. So women were permitted to wear pants for the first time, they were earning their own income, they were spending time alone together, and all of this brought about massive change for women in general, but it really shaped the formation of lesbian identity and community. And this wasn't just a United States situation, but we're focusing on the US here. So wearing pants outside of work became a way to flag your identity to other women. Bars were founded as public meeting spaces across the US and in some European cities and Canadian cities. And communities were formed for really the very first time in some semi-public spaces. So Vice President Wallace wrote in his diary that President Roosevelt spoke approvingly of a plan to, quote, to spread the Jews thin all over the world, end quote. His diary entry adds that, quote, the president said he had tried this out in Meriwether County, Georgia, where Roosevelt lived in the 1920s, and at Hyde Park on the basis of adding 4 or 5 Jewish families at each place. He claimed that the local population would have no objection if there were no more than that, end quote. So the American government had a really tepid response to the Holocaust. The US immigration system severely limited the number of German Jews admitted during the Nazi years to about 26,000 annually, but even that quota was less than 25% filled during most of the Hitler era because the Roosevelt administration piled on so many extra requirements for would-be immigrants. So for example, as of 1941, merely having a close relative still living in Europe was enough to disqualify an applicant because of the Roosevelt administration's absurd belief that the immigrant would become a spy for Hitler so that his relative in Europe would not be harmed by the Nazis. Black leaders proclaimed their own quote-unquote two-front war with the symbol of the double V to represent victory against racist enemies both abroad and at home. So the most volatile social issue ignited by the war was Black American participation in the military. Although the armed forces were still racially segregated in 1941, Black Americans rushed to enlist after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And as Black American Joe Louis, the world heavyweight boxing champion, put it, quote, lots of things are wrong with America, but Hitler ain't gonna fix them. So together, about 1 million Black Americans served in the armed forces during the war. Black soldiers and sailors assigned to racially segregated units were initially excluded from combat units. They loaded ships, drove trucks, dug latrines, and handed supplies and mail. Black officers could not command white soldiers and sailors. In late 1944, however, the need for more troops led the government to revisit its racial policies. Under pressure from the Black American community, as well as Eleanor Roosevelt, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commander of U.S. forces in Europe, agreed to let Black volunteers fight in 52 all-Black platoons. So these Black soldiers earned the reputation of being fierce fighters, and the same was true of some 600 Black American pilots, the so-called Tuskegee Airmen. These soldiers' unquestionable excellence spurred military and civilian leaders to desegregate the armed forces after the war. The fight against Nazism also reshaped how Americans thought about themselves. So the juxtaposition between racism that was inherent in the Nazi system and the supposed American virtues of diversity and tolerance and equality was a really popular talking point for FDR when he was talking about his international programs. But the US's treatment of Black Americans and other oppressed groups really proved to be a very embarrassing aspect of US domestic life that these leaders had to contend with. Because of this, the enemies that the US was fighting provided this golden opportunity for marginalized groups to plead their case that this was the time to give full civil rights. And the federal government supported this notion to some extent. Civil rights would soon become a key tenet in modern liberalism. Black Americans also experienced a lot of change and also a continuation of racial discrimination on the home front. So around 700,000 Black Americans left the South for better opportunities during the war years, and more than 1 million joined the industrial workforce for the first time. Lured by jobs and higher wages in military-related plants and factories, African Americans from the South headed to more industrialized regions, especially the growing western cities such as Seattle, Portland, and Los Angeles. This demographic shift